What is up, hockey fans? Welcome to the Wraparound brought to you by Sticks.com. I'm Emma Lingan. I'm joined by my co-host, Michael Augello, and we have so much to get into today with bite-sized topics from around the NHL. It's playoff season, of course, but we've also got lots of other things going on, so we're going to just dive right into it. But before we do want to mention again, we are brought to you by our friends at Sticks.com. Why break the bank on sticks when you can get pro-level composite sticks without the pro price tag at Sticks.com? That's STIX.com. Head over now and gear up. And honestly, Michael, I think that there's some angry players in the St. Louis Blues locker room who are going to need to go to Sticks.com and get some new sticks because they're probably breaking them over their just gut-wrenching loss to the Winnipeg Jets in Game 7 of the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. I mean, the Jets put together one of the biggest comebacks in Stanley Cup playoff history. This was on Sunday. They scored 2 goals in the final minute and 56 seconds of the third period, including the game-tying goal with literally 3 seconds left in regulation. Kept their season alive, took it to overtime, ends up going to double overtime. Then, of course, Adam Lowry, the captain, gets the double OT goal to send the Jets to the second round for the first time in 4 years. So we know, obviously, one of the biggest storylines from this entire series has been the play of Connor Hellebuyck, who I believe you, Michael, trademarked the phrase Four Nations Connor versus regular season Connor. And I think that arguably we may have seen worse than Four Nations Connor in the first round of the playoffs. He was pulled 3 times in the first round, all on the road. Do you think a win like the one that the Jets got on Sunday in double OT is going to do enough for Hellebuyck's confidence and his team's confidence in him as a whole moving forward?
You would hope, but I mean, it's ironic that they score those 2 goals in the last 2 minutes of regulation with Hellebuyck on the bench with the extra attacker. I mean, in Game 7, you were hoping that he could shake off his issues that he had in St. Louis, as you said, pulled 3 times for Eric Comrie. There was even some debate during the game. Are you going to pull him after giving up those 2 goals early in the first period? I didn't think he was particularly strong. The Kyrou goal was just a breakdown defensively, but the Matthew Joseph goal, he didn't have the angle correct. And on the Foxa goal, which I thought was the dagger, I thought that was the one that was going to kill the Jets. I think he thought he had the angle bad on that one. So it's the most improbable comeback and that I can remember. And I'm thinking 2013 4-1 Leafs Bruins. This one's worse because they didn't have their best defenseman. Morrissey got hurt in the first period. They didn't have their best forward. Scheifele has been out the last 2 games. Their goaltender, who's probably going to win the Hart Trophy, is playing not up to par. And they still tie the game. And yeah, the Blues have to be cracking sticks over their head, and there's a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth in the Blues locker room, but they really have nobody to blame but themselves because they sort of sat back and let the Jets take the attack to them, and in the end that killed them.
Well, and it's crazy to think that not 24 hours earlier we had seen what we thought was going to be probably the most surprising Game 7 comeback of the series, or of the playoffs rather. And I mean, now it looks like old news compared to what happened in with Winnipeg and St. Louis, but still got to talk about it. Still incredibly impressive comeback from Mikko Rantanen and the Dallas Stars against the Colorado Avalanche in Game 7 of their series. So Rantanen obviously puts on the historic performance against his former team, of course, because these storylines just write themselves sometimes. And he had the first third period hat trick in Game 7 history, added an assist on Wyatt Johnston's goal in the third, which ended up being the game winner. And then Rantanen scored into the empty net to complete the hat trick. But looking at this, I mean, obviously, of course, we're going to have some recency bias here, but he Rantanen single-handedly dragged his team back into the fight in the third period, and it is just the first round, but I mean, this was a conference final level matchup of teams. So, where do you think this performance ranks among the great playoff performances of all time?
It's way up there. I mean, it's the most impressive performance I've seen in a long while, and I would die to be a fly on the wall uh, the day after with Chris McFarland and Joe Sakic and how the miscalculation of what they did and trading Rantanen and then it ending up coming back to bite them because he wouldn't sign in Carolina and goes to their division rival. And then they face them in that 2-3 corridor of death, as I call it, which is ridiculous because you're right. It should be a conference final. So maybe even Florida Tampa should have been a conference final with the way how good those two teams have been were in the regular season. But he single-handedly took that team on his back and scored the goal to make it 2-1, scored the goal to tie it 2-2, and then Wyatt Johnston scores the game winner. I mean, pretty much I think everybody had written off the Stars. They were without Heiskanen, they were without Robertson. They're down 2-0 to the Avalanche in the third period, and they get off the mat, they come back and they win that game. And now Colorado is scratching their head. And Dallas, I almost think Dallas was happy that Winnipeg won because now you've got a team that's just as depleted as they are without Morrissey, without Scheifele, and they're going to get Heiskanen and Robertson back, and we don't know what's going to happen with the two Jets players.
I think it just goes to show you do not bet against Pete DeBoer in a game 7. He cannot lose. And I think to your point about the Avalanche, you don't always see those moves come back to bite the other team so quickly the way that it did with Rantanen and the Avalanche this year. Of course, as you said, getting traded to a division rival. And, to their credit, Colorado is one of the most aggressive teams this season. I mean, sometimes it's easy to forget they started this year with 2 different goaltenders than the 2 that they had when they ended. And they were one of the most aggressive teams at the trade deadline. They tried to surround their core players with some veteran talent. As a whole, I mean, in theory, you really can't fault any of the moves that they made around the trade deadline. It seemed like they did everything right and still just fell short because Dallas is that deep and that strong. So really, there was no way that series wasn't going to 7 games. And, I think it was definitely as advertised.
I was just going to add, the Avalanche now have a dilemma because they traded all these draft picks and all these prospects for rental players like Brock Nelson and Charlie Coyle. And now you lose in the first round. You need to sign these guys. Otherwise, you've given up all those assets for a rental, and now you don't have young prospects coming into the organization. That's going to be a challenge for Chris McFarland and Joe Sakic.
Definitely, for sure. And you've got guys out of the Rantanen trade like Marty Necas, like Jack Drury, who can be long-term pieces for you, which is somewhat of a silver lining, but agreed. You still have to sort of make up for your losses there with all of the moves they did make at the deadline. You mentioned Florida Tampa being another conference final level matchup. Unfortunately, we didn't really see the regular season Tampa Bay Lightning show up in the playoffs. Panthers took that series in 5 games. They will now face the Toronto Maple Leafs in the second round. That series begins tonight in Toronto. So the Maple Leafs, it was getting a little hairy there for a minute. We all thought the Leafs were going to leaf and they were going to give up their series lead and let the Ottawa Senators take it from them. They didn't, just barely. They made it to the second round. But now that they have, we talk a lot about the Leafs core 4, those guys that tend to not show up in the playoffs for whatever reason. Now, I would say John Tavares of those 4 has shown up for them in this playoffs, but beyond Tavares and maybe even beyond those 4 or within those 4, is there anyone in particular on the Leafs who you think really needs to kick it up a notch, reach another level in order for the Leafs to have a chance against the defending champions?
Well, leave out the goaltending here. If we're talking about skaters, Tavares was consistent in the series against Ottawa. Nylander scored 2 goals in Game 6, but Game 5 he was responsible mostly for the Dylan Cousins shorthanded goal. I thought Matthews played well, but he's just not scoring like Matthews, so we know there's something wrong with him. The key guy, and I hate to say it, but it keeps coming back, is the new daddy, Mitch Marner. Mitch Marner, he had 8 points, so he was second on the team in scoring. He scored 1 goal. And other than doing well on the penalty kill, in the second half of that series, the only thing that he really did was assist on Matthews' power play goal in Game 6. He has got to step it up to a higher level for this team to have a chance to beat Florida. Florida is going to come right at them. They're going to be physical. They're going to be offensive in all ways with Marchand and Bennett and Kachuk. And the Leafs are going to have to find a way to repel that. And if they can't, they're going to go down.
Well, you mentioned goaltending. Now I want to ask you specifically about the goaltending for Toronto in this series. Now, interesting storyline. Anthony Stolarz now facing his former team in the Florida Panthers. He was their backup all the way through the Stanley Cup final last year. Looking at now that he's in a very different role with the Leafs. So he's taken over as the number 1 goalie. Do you think, are there concerns that you have about his ability to handle this kind of workload that he hasn't really had to handle before? And sort of in addition to that, do you think there's a chance, barring an injury or something unexpected, do you think that there's a chance that we do see Joseph Woll for Toronto in this series?
I think there's a chance. I mean, Berube clearly has made the decision that Stolarz is his goaltender. I thought he played okay against Ottawa, but there were instances where they didn't face a lot of shots and he let in key goals. Brady Tkachuk in Game 2, I think he had 3 shots in the third period, and they scored the tying goal. Not to take away from the quality of the chances, but when you face that few shots, you need your goaltender to make the save. The key in this series is the goaltending matching up to Bobrovsky. I mean, Bobrovsky has been great in the playoffs in Columbus and the 2 runs that the Panthers have made to the Stanley Cup final. One they won, one they lost. The Leafs are going to need Bobrovsky to not play as well as he has in the past, and they're going to need Stolarz or Woll to step up. The concern with Stolarz is he's never played this many games, and these are high-intensity games. So, Ridley Gregg tried to take his knee out in Game 1. I wouldn't doubt, even though he's their buddy, even though Sam Reinhart gave Anthony Stolarz a cat, that doesn't matter. They would run their mother through the boards to win a game. So they could try to get in Stolarz's kitchen. They know the guy. They know his personality. So it's going to be a key, but I think you could see Woll at some point in this series.
All right. Well, one other second round series that we haven't talked about yet today, we've talked about it before. I was so sure this was going to be the year, finally, and I don't think I was alone in this. I was sure this was going to be the year that LA finally took down Edmonton in the first round. And yet, the hockey gods reminded us all, you never bet against a team that has Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. Of course, the Oilers had a remarkable first round series against the Kings. They won 4 straight after going down 0-2 in the series. So they will now face the Vegas Golden Knights in round 2. The Golden Knights, of course, took down the Minnesota Wild in 6 games in the first round. Of course, one of the biggest storylines that has kept coming up, and I think it will keep coming up for the Edmonton Oilers, is their goaltending. They really do not have a strong situation in net. Stuart Skinner got chased during that first round series. They ended up going with Calvin Pickard. And if you're winning games, you stick with what works. And so they stuck with Pickard through the end of the series. looking ahead to the series against Vegas, who I think, it's not a stretch at all to say that Vegas has a lot more scoring threats than LA does. Going, up against this team with this structure, these many weapons, do you think the Oilers are going to stick with Calvin Pickard? And why or why not? And then I'm curious how many games you see this series going.
I think they'll stick with Pickard to start because obviously Skinner struggled in that series against the Kings. And, just to go back quickly, the Kings blew that series. I mean, they were up 2-0. They were up in the third period of game 3. Jim Hiller made the worst coaching decision of the playoffs thus far. Trying to get that goal reversed and then giving the Edmonton Oilers a power play, and then they scored 10 seconds after that. And then they were winning 3-1 in game 4. I mean, they had that series. They could have swept, and they let Edmonton off the mat, and then Edmonton beat them soundly in game 5 and then in game 6, obviously. So I think they'll stay with Pickard, but I think it's a quick hook. I think if they lose the first couple games and they're down 2-0 and they're going back to Edmonton, I think they could go back to Skinner. I mean, the Edmonton Oilers' problems are bigger than their goaltending. They're not getting Ekholm. I believe Chris Knobloch said it's doubtful they get him back in the second round. And LA was unable to take advantage of Edmonton's defense, which is not good. Vegas will. This is the same formula that happened a few years ago when Vegas won the Stanley Cup. They struggled in the first round, and then the ball got rolling down the hill, and then they were unstoppable. This team knows how to crush McDavid and Draisaitl. They will spend every waking moment hitting them and wearing them down. And with what Edmonton uses them, they use them 25 minutes a night. Eventually they'll wear them down. I think the series is going to go probably 6 games, and I'm picking Vegas to win that series.
All right. Well, we'll see if finally the Oilers can get taken down in these playoffs. LA couldn't do it. There was some fallout as a result of that, and we are going to get to that later in the show today. But first, want to wrap up talking about the Washington Capitals and the Carolina Hurricanes. That's our other Eastern Conference matchup for round 2. Of course, Freddie Andersen being a big storyline for the Hurricanes in round 1. He got injured, and Pyotr Kochetkov had to come in and start their last game against the New Jersey Devils. They were able to get past New Jersey without Jack Hughes. Not a huge surprise there. Now they're facing, I think we can all agree, a much higher level of competition. So with Andersen, he's been skating with the team. He looks like he might be good to go, but we also don't know if he's at 100% or how close to 100% he is. So how big of a factor is Andersen's availability going to be for the Hurricanes in this series against Washington?
I think it's a significant factor because clearly Rod Brind'Amour does not trust Pyotr Kochetkov. He's the goalie that played 50 games during the regular season, and then they go to Freddie Andersen in the playoffs. Andersen played well against New Jersey, but that's New Jersey. I mean, they didn't have a ton of offense. They were mortally wounded by the loss of Hughes, and then they lost half their defense. So I don't know if it's an accurate indicator of how good Freddie Andersen is, or if he can stand on his head and beat Washington. I think Washington should be heavily favored in this series. I'm not taking anything away from Carolina. They have talent. I just don't think they're as good a team as they were a couple years ago. I don't think their defense is as good. I'm still skeptical about Andersen, even though he played well in the first round. And I don't know if they have the offense to compete with Washington. So all things being equal, I think the Capitals are going to win this series probably in 6 games.
Well, speaking of Andersen, the Hurricanes actually ended up signing him to a 1-year, $2.75 million extension this week. They also extended Taylor Hall earlier in the playoffs, 3 years at $3.67 million. It's Interesting. We were talking about this before the show. It seems like no other teams are doing this during the playoffs. Any other team that had extensions to get hammered out, they either got it done before the regular season was over or they are waiting until the playoffs are over, which is more commonplace. So, what do you think the thought process is for the Hurricanes by extending guys during the middle of a playoff run? And just what are your thoughts on the deals in particular?
Well, Andersen first, I think it's a reflection of how bad the summer free agent goalie market is. We talked about this before. I think he was probably the best free agent goaltender, and at his age was willing to take a 1-year deal. I mean, I don't think that, if we're dining out on July 1st waiting for goalies to be signed as free agents, we're going to be waiting probably till July 10th because there's not really a number one goalie out there. What's going to happen is probably at the draft and leading into free agency, you've got Demko, you've got Gibson, you've got Tristan Jarry. There have been Jeremy Swayman rumors. I don't know if I buy that. Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen in Buffalo. There's a lot of goalies that are going to be on the trade market, and nobody's going to get a goalie for free. So, the Taylor Hall deal, I mean, I almost get a feeling, Emma, that this was like, okay, we didn't get Rantanen, and we have to have something to show for all those moves that we made. So he's a former number one pick, and he's willing to take, and he's got got a young family, and he wants to stay here. So let's sign him. And it's not big money, but the reasons for them signing him, I don't think have a lot to do with his great production because he hasn't been producing great lately.
Yeah, I would agree. Of course, they do net Logan Stankoven out of the deal for Rantanen, which is a great young piece, and he's been productive for them in the playoffs, especially. So that's good. But I agree with you. I think there's a little bit of, okay, we need to make this worth it kind of thing with Taylor Hall. He's obviously past his prime, not the player he once was, but a solid depth forward for them, and he's got playoff experience, so that's always helpful. Looking elsewhere around the league, the Calgary Flames signed Matt Coronato to a 7-year extension with an AAV of $6.5 million. So keeping in mind the salary cap is going up, and Coronato's 22 years old. He was drafted 13th overall in 2021. He hit career highs this season with 24 goals, 47 points. Again, still very early in his career. A lot of times we see 7-year extension and think, ooh, geez, that's, there's no way that could be a steal. But looking at the cap going up and what he's done and sort of his trajectory in Calgary, do you think Coronato could end up, when all's said and done, being a steal for the Flames?
Yeah, I mean, they're rolling the dice, but they're being proactive. And, Calgary's not a big market. And if the player is willing and the deal is good, then you go ahead and do it. And as you said, he scored 24 goals last year. This is sort of like their answer to what Utah did with Dylan Guenther. A player who had not fully established himself, but had a good, I think it was a half season with Utah. And then let's get him locked up now. Let's get him locked up on a number that is good because, we're probably not going to be a cap team, but if we get this guy locked up, $6.5 million for 7 years. I mean, in 7 years, the cap could be $125 million, and then 6.5 is nothing. So, he's a smaller player, but he's really talented, and 24 goals is nothing to sneeze at. So I understand what the Flames are doing, and it's a risk worth taking.
All right. Well, other news out of the league this week, the Jack Adams Award finalists were announced. So they are Scott Arniel at Winnipeg, Spencer Carberry in Washington, and Marty St. Louis in Montreal. Now, I think Carberry, we all sort of assumed was going to be the favorite, and probably still is the favorite to win the award with what he's done with this Capitals team in just one season. So in your mind, though, looking at these three as the finalists, I think that there have been other names that have kind of been floated around in the discussion throughout the year. With the three that we've ended up with here, do you think these are the three best coaches in the league this season? And if not, is there any name that you think should be there that isn't?
Well, I do think, and we don't know, like, in terms of the voting, who will finish 4th, 5th, 6th. But what Craig Berube did in Toronto is pretty special, because you've got a team with a lot of noise around them, a lot of distraction. And this is the first time they won the Atlantic Division. Now, I didn't expect him to be one of the top 3, but I think if he's in the top 5 or 6, that's probably right. You have to look at what Jim Hiller did in LA, and they had a great regular season, but then they went out quickly, and we know this award is based on regular season. So there are a couple coaches out there that I think maybe deserved a little bit of consideration, but I think they got the 3 right. And don't even, I mean, if there's a betting line, don't even, don't bother. I mean, it's probably like plus 8,000 or minus 8,000 for Carberry. He's going to win it. He's going to win it running away. But what St. Louis did in Montreal and what Arneal did in Winnipeg is pretty good.
Yeah, and there was a lot of impressive coaching performances this year. I think guys like John Hines in Minnesota did a really good job with that team. Of course, they hit some injuries in the second half that, kind of took a little bit of the wind out of their sails, but still really strong performance from them. And, I don't think that has a guy ever become a Jack Adams finalist after getting fired midseason? I don't know, but I think Jim Montgomery and what he's done in St. Louis has been pretty impressive as well. So definitely lots of flowers to go around here among the NHL head coaches. But I agree. I think these are the 3. Carberry clearly the best. Speaking of coaching, the Rangers officially hired Mike Sullivan. He was not out of work for long. He, after being let go or mutually parting ways with the Penguins, he is now the 38th head coach in franchise history. He was obviously going to be a hot commodity on the market, in a market where a lot of teams are in need of a head coach right now. So there was rumors he could end up in Boston. That's where he's from, and he's coached there before, but ends up in New York. Do you think that this roster that the Rangers have, again, it is crazy to think after not playing in the playoffs this year, they are still just 1 year removed from being the President's Trophy winners. So do you think that they are close enough to contending that the addition of Sullivan can help the turnaround occur quickly in New York?
Sullivan looked at the teams that were available and saw Igor Shesterkin between the pipes and said, I'm going there. I think it's very possible that there could be a quick turnaround, although, Chris Drury basically threw a hand grenade into the locker room this year. You got players that are still on the roster who may not want to be there, and it's going to be up to Sullivan to sort of smooth things and get things back on an even keel. I mean, there's a lot of talent there, but they moved a lot of players out, and I don't know if they're as good as they were when they won the President's Trophy, but I think he can get them back into the playoffs. The other teams that you mentioned, if Philadelphia, Boston, they were all rebuilds. He's just coming out of a rebuild. I mean, Kyle, the whole mutually parting, Kyle Dubas got a 7-year contract for a reason, because he knew that the core of that Penguins team, as great as they are decrepit. They're just old. They're falling apart, and you couldn't win. So that's why you got a 7-year deal. And I think Sullivan realized the direction that they were going was a rebuild. I don't know if Crosby's going to go someplace else, or Malkin or Letang, but they may as well, because that team's not going to win. And Sullivan said, okay, I'll go someplace else because this team is not going anywhere.
Seems like a more diplomatic, professional version of what John Tortorella did in Philadelphia, where he essentially said, I'm not interested in coaching a team that's losing, and decided to move on. At this stage in his career, he's earned that right. But again, I think of the teams with opportunities available, New York definitely looks like the closest. So will be interesting to see. Of course, you mentioned Shesterkin. I'm sure it also helps that the Rangers threw a lot of money at Mike Sullivan, so that never hurts either. Wrapping up today, I mentioned it earlier, there was a bit of fallout from the LA Kings losing to the Oilers in the first round this series. We learned Monday morning Kings GM Rob Blake has mutually parted ways with the club. I think, this is a topic we've talked about before. I would argue this was maybe about 2 years too late. But what are your thoughts on the decision with Rob Blake and where the Kings go from here?
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, because, I mean, this is a team that I think has wasted the last couple years of Drew Doughty and Anze Kopitar still being at a high level. They really could have advanced and done much better in that Pacific Division than they have. They keep running in, because of the playoff structure, they keep running into the Oilers, and they had an opportunity this year. I didn't think Kemper was a great acquisition, but the way that they played defense, he had a fantastic year, only lost 5 times at home. But at the deadline, and we talked about this, Andrei Kuzmenko, I don't care how great he played in the playoffs, you needed to add more to that roster to have a chance against the Oilers, and they didn't, and they came up short. So yeah, I think it was on. I didn't know whether Rob Blake's job was on the line, but clearly it was. There's some talent there. They've got all their draft picks, but they're in a situation where I think they have to consider a change of direction, get yourself an established goalie, even though Kemper is a Vezina Trophy nominee, and you got to get more scoring. And those are not easy things to do, but I think they can be done if they get a new general manager who has a positive outlook.
Yeah, Kemper's a guy who, he'll show up and have an amazing year, and then he'll disappear for like 3 or 4 years before he has another one. So you need a little bit more consistency in goal. I agree. And then I think, the need to add more scoring. If you're in the Pacific Division, you're probably not going to compete with Vegas. For a while, you weren't going to compete with Edmonton until this year. Now it was like, oh, this could actually be their chance. And again, even going back to not just the trade deadline, but free agency last year, they needed to add more scoring. They went out and got Warren Foegele and Tanner Jeannot. Like, you need to aim higher than that, I think, if you're going to try to compete with the Oilers, with the Golden Knights and teams like that. So will be interesting to see what direction they do decide to go in LA. And that is something that we will certainly keep an eye on throughout the off season. But for now, that is going to do it for today's episode of the Wraparound. Thank you again to Michael Augello for joining me today. Once again, I am Emma Lingan. We want to thank Stix.com, and we are back here with an all new episode next week. We will see you then.